Welcome back, everybody. I'm Yasmin Vasugian. We are on the scene of America's latest deadly mass shooting, this time in Miami-Dade. We have the very latest on the conditions of the victims, how it happened, what we know about the gunman, plus this.
We clearly have to get to the bottom of what happened, why it happened, and how do we prevent something like that from ever happening again. We're going to reevaluate what the way forward is in the next few days.
I would have preferred that be an independent, outside investigation that was nonpartisan, but I think now it'll be an investigation in Congress.
Democrats and Republicans not shying away on the fight over an insurrection commission. A look at the next logical step in this process and who a majority of Republicans believe is to blame for what happened on January 6th. You won't believe it. And investigating Donald Trump as prosecutors ramp up their investigation into the former president. Another name always comes up, doesn't it? Rudy Giuliani. Could the former mayor end up in prison? Also this.
People here in Tulsa did everything that was asked of them, and then the result was it was destroyed with the help of the government. And I feel I needed to be here, to be with my ancestors and say, we think that yours should be paid. After 100 years is long overdue.
We're going to take you to Tulsa, where commemorations are underway to honor the lives of Black Americans killed 100 years ago. And the commission established to educate this country on why this dark chapter in American history should never be forgotten. And balancing your health privacy to the safety of others, a discussion about vaccine passports, the laws being passed to stop them, and knowing when you're safe around strangers in the middle of a pandemic. But I want to begin with that breaking news out of Florida. The search is now underway in Miami-Dade County for the three shooters after a mass shooting at a concert hall. That's where we find Sam Brock, who's on the scene and has been talking with police. Sam, good to see you this afternoon. Thanks for joining us on this. What more do we know? I know you've been speaking with Miami-Dade Police Department.
A lot more now than we did, Yasmin. Even an hour ago, I sat down with the director of the Miami-Dade Police Department to find out what happened here, what they know, what they don't know. At this point in time, the three suspected gunmen in this case are unknown, their whereabouts. They're putting all resources and efforts they have in Miami right now to find them. But we do know this, Yasmin. When this happened this morning between 12 a.m. and 1 a.m., when that car came in, the SUV the police were describing, it was here for a matter of minutes, maybe more, in the parking lot before that gunfire started. And I am told from Director Ramirez that the individuals who fired were targeting a specific person or persons, and that everybody else who got hit with that crossfire was collateral damage. We also learned that there was crossfire returned from folks who were at the banquet hall, which, if you look over my shoulder right now, Yasmin, is at the far end of the shopping center next to a child care. You can see some yellow police tape down there and a row of white cars. It's right in that area. And so this all unfolding in the middle of the night, gunfire exchanged. There's also a lot of yellow markers around there, somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 or 90 of them. And I asked the director if that means there were potentially 100 rounds of ammunition exchanged. He said, yes, absolutely, that's possible. These men were using assault-style, AK-47 style weapons, according to Director Ramirez, and they are very concerned right now about the violence they're seeing. 20 people were shot and injured. 2 have deceased since, but there are now 3 people, Yasmin, this is also new information, who are in critical condition, which means we may be looking at 5 total fatalities should those 3 not be able to battle through their injuries. It is a very dire situation. The director calling this the worst mass shooting he has seen in his 26 years in Miami-Dade. Here is a snippet of our conversation.
I think that it was probably targeted on a specific person at that event, and they really didn't care about who was standing around. They were determined to do what they were going to do, and as a result, innocent people were shot and lost their lives due to the actions of these criminals. And unfortunately, even though, as you see, the last few months our homicide rates have been going down, but it's these situations like these strategic attacks that we've been experiencing with people with assault rifles is what really puts law enforcement, alarmed in our community as well. And that's why it takes both of us, all of us together, to put a stop to this.
Yasmin, part of the reason right now that you are seeing troopers over my shoulder, they weren't standing here for most of the day. The reason they're there now is because family members, people who have identified themselves as loved ones of victims, have shown up and trying to gain access to the actual crime scene and have been denied as investigators continue to process it. That is ongoing. And again, we do not know where the 3 people who started this fight have gone. And all resources are being dedicated to that right now. But what a terrifying prospect for these parents who've told us today like Angelica Green, that she heard from her son, 24 years old, shot in the stomach, and he was describing how much it hurts to her over and over again, and she and her husband were telling their son, stay with us, stay with us. And he was one of those who was hospitalized and underwent surgery. There are so many families right now, more than a dozen of them, that are experiencing something in that vein. And we're going to continue to stay on top of this, Yasmin.
Wow. Devastating update. Sam Brock, thank you. I want to turn now to Capitol Hill, where Democrats are weighing their options for investigating the January 6th riot after Republicans blocked legislation this week to create an independent commission to look into the attack. This is new polling reveals that a majority of Americans believe former President Trump is not at all to blame for the riot, instead blaming left-wing protesters. NBC's Amanda Golden's on Capitol Hill for us. Amanda, good to see you. What are the options here for Democrats right now, and what reaction are you hearing from those on the Hill?
Well, Yasmin, the likeliest option now is for House Democrats to establish what's called a select committee, and that would allow House Dems to be able to investigate January 6th on their own. They wouldn't need Republicans on board in order to establish this select committee to look into the events leading up to and through January 6th. And part of what this would allow House Democrats to do is have subpoena power to bring in witnesses to testify, as well as be able to schedule hearings and really drive that investigation into the events that led to January 6th, as well as former President Trump's influence into the attack that we saw take place. And of course, the reason that this is all now the likeliest option on the table is because of that procedural vote that was blocked by Senate Republicans at the end of the week to move forward that bipartisan independent commission. That did not reach enough Republican senators to support Democrats with this commission in order to break through a Senate filibuster. Only 6 Republican senators joined with Democrats when they needed at least 10 to hit that 60 vote threshold. And now that they are moving into this potential commission, this potential select committee that could be just Democrats, there's some very strong words coming from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi as to the political calculations that she feels some of these Republican senators took by not joining Democrats in support of the independent commission. I want to read you just a portion of her statement. She said, quote, Mitch McConnell asked Senate Republicans to do him a personal favor and vote against the January 6th commission. In doing so, Mitch McConnell asked them to be complicit in his undermining of the truth of January 6th. But of course, Democrats want to investigate what happened on January 6th now with the potential of the select committee. And we heard some from Congressman Jason Crow earlier today on Meet the Press, both what he saw unfold with the commission being blocked and now what the potential select committee could do in moving forward. Take a listen.
We think there were a couple more people that would have voted for it had they been present. So the question is, can we get those 3 or 4 additional votes, or are we just delaying the inevitable? And that is, are we going to have to take up a select committee? But this has to get done. I am sick of playing the game of whack-a-mole with GOP members in the Congress. Every time we, address one of their concerns, another one pops up.
And Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer did say that he has within his power to put that commission, the independent bipartisan commission, back onto the Senate floor for a vote in the future. But at this point, there still is no indication that 10 Republican senators would come on board unless Mitch McConnell were to do something to incite members of his own caucus to come along with this commission, which he is not giving any indication that he wants to do. So, of course, now it does go to House Democrats to move forward, while congressional leadership did want this to be bipartisan and independent in the commission's nature. The only option forward really does seem to be the select committee led by House Democrats. Yasmin.
All right, Amanda Golden for us on Capitol Hill. Thank you, Amanda. Good to talk to you. Want to bring in my panel of experts, Emily Tish Sussman, host of your Political Playlist podcast, Democratic strategist and former vice president of campaigns for the Center for American Progress. Daniel Littman, political reporter covering the White House in Washington. David Jolly, former congressman from Florida and an MSNBC political contributor. I'm having some allergy issues, guys, so if I start coughing, someone just jump in and start talking, okay? It's a really bad allergy season for me. Daniel, I'm going to start with you on this one. Let's talk about some of the options that Amanda just laid out for us, and considering a select committee essentially seeming that's the only option for Democrats to move forward here. Of course, Chuck Schumer at one point saying that he's going to call for a vote once again, but we know the results are going to be the same. What does that look like, considering this will likely be seen as a more partisan investigation than would have an independent investigation?
So that select committee would have subpoena power. It would basically operate as a independent commission, except it would be seen as a kind of a naked partisan exercise by many Americans, and so it would undermine the credibility of the committee's findings, and that would make it harder for them to suggest changes for congressional security, for how the Pentagon played in this insurrection, and also Democrats are pointing out that this is basically the first major disaster in the last 100 years where we did not have a bipartisan commission. After Pearl Harbor, JFK's assassination, after 9/11, there were all these types of commissions. And now, because of the Republican Party's loyalty to Trump, that's off the table.
Emily, I want to read for you from a piece on the Hill about the January 6 probes being labeled partisan. Any congressional investigation into January 6 risks appearances that the process will be partisan and the findings will be dismissed by conservative voters as a result. Yet GOP leaders are labeling even the independent commission slanted, despite the bipartisan agreement to create it and the equal party divide among its members. I can't help but think, Emily, that this may have been a strategy from Republicans. Had they come out of an independent investigation, the result would have been seen as bipartisan, right? Because they would have both been appointed by both Republicans and Democrats. But now they can look at a Democratic investigation as completely and utterly partisan, as a strategy on their part.
Absolutely. Look, it's an attempt to fix the result by fixing the rules as you go into it. If they're not going to like the results, they think they're not going to like the result of an independent commission, then just change the rules or don't agree to independent rules in the first place. It's exactly what the congressman was saying. It's whack-a-mole. Look, this was actually the topic of my podcast this upcoming week, about connecting Donald Trump and the big lie and the Republicans willing to go along with it with the legislative changes they're either blocking in Congress or attempting at a state level. Republicans are trying to change the rules in voting once again at the state level based on it, and trying to block any changes like an independent commission, like the For the People Act, the democracy reform bill that's up in the Senate. At every level, we're seeing it because of this loyalty to Trump. Look, if we're sick about talking about Trump, and believe me, I am sick about talking about Trump, but the Republican Party is so complicit in him right now and staying committed to him. They're not willing to have the hard conversations with their supporters because they're afraid of losing their own seats of power. And so we're seeing Republicans start to go further and further down the road of just supporting Trump at every level, to the point where we're really seeing chipping away at what we know of a democracy.
David Jolly, I want you to weigh in on some of this polling because I think it's astounding. Yahoo YouGov poll on who the GOP blamed for the Capitol riots. 23%, was 1 in 4 say Trump is to blame. 52%, over half, say Trump is not to blame at all. And that left-wing protesters, 73% saying this, are trying to make Trump look bad. 73% say left-wing protesters were trying to make Trump look bad. I go on. Ipsos poll on who the GOP think is the true president. Over half of Republicans believe Trump is the true president, David Jolly.
Yeah, look, Republican voters are not making these decisions in a vacuum. They are listening to Republican leaders. And let's be very clear, it was Republicans that stormed the Capitol. It was not Democrats that stormed the Capitol. It was not Democratic-leaning activists. Donald Trump is responsible for the events of January 6th. He laid the predicate with the big lie. His political organization issued the invitation for people to come to Washington on January 6th. And then he spoke at the rally and said, go to the Capitol with strength, not with weakness. I will tell you regarding the January 6th commission, though, I think the politics on the Republican side are just getting warmed up. They want this to be a Democratic-led Democratic-led special committee in the Congress, because I wouldn't be surprised if they refuse to testify. Even though the committee will have subpoena power, now that it's a House committee, if Kevin McCarthy is called to testify, he will likely invoke privileges that are afforded certain members to not be subpoenaed by a committee. And look, who knows how that turns out? But what we know from the Don McGahn testimony is this could be litigated for years. This is all about the politics of 2022. Republicans are gambling that the American people will care less about them filibustering an independent commission than what they would care about learning from an independent commission. So I expect Republicans to continue to forestall this as long as they can and paint it as a Democratic investigation solely for partisan measures.
Daniel Littman, talk to me about the filibuster here. This was the first filibuster for the Republicans. We certainly know it's not going to be the last. How does this filibuster debate loom over this overarching conversation, especially when we're looking at major legislation the Biden administration wants to get through, major spending legislation the Biden administration wants to get through that Republicans have already been vocal about they're not for?
It just gives much more ammunition to the Democratic senators who are saying enough is enough. We can't have these types of fake filibusters where it's not even a real filibuster. It's just basically, not a talking exercise where senators are speaking for 24 hours straight. This is more just in the Senate rules as adopted. It's not in the Constitution at all. And Democrats are getting tired of having this block their agenda in terms of voting rights, gun control, other issues. And so I think they're waiting to see if they can reach an infrastructure deal. And if they can't, they'll pass that through reconciliation. But it just gives, much more energy to people on the left to say this is not democratic.
Emily, let me read for you from the Washington Post talking about the filibuster and saying, listen, it's not essentially that easy. And even if the Democrats were to get rid of the filibuster, they'd still need to have a majority. And they have some outliers. Joe Manchin, I should mention, Republicans saying here, and even some Democrats argue it's not that easy, and that advocates of getting rid of the filibuster don't acknowledge another problematic reality for the party. Senate Democrats don't currently have the 50 votes needed to pass major parts of the Biden agenda, even if they scrap the 60-vote threshold. A real reality, Emily, for the Democrats.
Yeah, that always becomes the argument, and it's real. But getting rid of the filibuster there would be incentive to bring moderate Democrats to the table and bring moderate Republicans to the table, because they might actually see pieces of their agenda get into the eventual legislation. So it actually does bring them there. The way that the lack of the January 6th commission going through, I actually think heavily plays into this, is because and by the way, it's not just Manchin and Sinema who are not for getting rid of the filibuster right now. It is broader than that. It's Angus King, it's Jeanne Shaheen. It goes beyond. And so I think those two get a lot of heat for holding it up, and fairly they are publicly. But the way I think it plays in is because they're holding on to it for two things, saying, one, the filibuster actually brings a possibility of working with Republicans and bipartisanship together. So they're waiting to see, as Dan pointed out, they're waiting to see if that plays out in the infrastructure bill. I think the total nonpartisan commission failing kind of undercuts waiting to see if anything happens on infrastructure. But the other argument they make is that anything that is done to us will come back to us tenfold. So they're worried that if Democrats scrap the filibuster, Republicans will take over the Senate in the next election, and then it's just going to be total mayhem. I think that is also like a little bit outdated as an argument at this point after the Supreme Court. Like, Republicans won't agree to anything they said yes to 5 minutes ago. Anything they said they supported under the Trump administration, they can't even get to on principle under a Biden administration, and pushing through, holding up Garland and then pushing through their own nominees. So that's kind of outdated. So I think the inability to move forward with a bipartisan commission does kind of kill any arguments that are left, and I think may end up pushing some of these moderate Democrats over the line into killing the filibuster.
David Jolly, I got to read for you from the Huffington Post, because this reality is astounding, especially when you think about the midterms and the next presidential election, quite frankly. And you think about the law, right, sitting essentially on the governor's desk in Texas. It's not sitting there yet, but the governor vowing to pass it, right, this Texas voting rights law. Will the coming elections be undermined by the new laws that make it harder to vote and easier for Republican officials to override election rules in jurisdictions run by Democrats? Will proponents of the stolen election myth win races to run state elections and refuse to certify elections won by Democrats? As it looks now, the insurrection did not end on January 6th. It was just the beginning, David Jolly.
Yeah, that's a very fair opinion. What Republican legislatures across the country are doing is giving additional tools to Republicans for future elections to try to undermine the results. We can look at these new state laws being implemented in Georgia, Florida, Texas, and elsewhere through two lenses, Yasmin. One is the traditional voter suppression, right? We know they are making it harder to vote and likely having a disparate impact on the ability to vote for communities of color and Democratic-leaning voters. But the other lens through which we can look at this is the fact that they are taking away kind of the fair arbitration of elections from nonpartisan objective decision makers, traditionally secretaries of state or division of elections. We're seeing that in Georgia. And last night in the bill that passed through the Texas Senate, it actually says if sufficient number of fraudulent ballots are discovered, those ballots don't have to be open to see who they voted for. If there's enough that covers the margin between the winner and the loser, a judge can void the entire election. In other words, they don't have to look further to see if those fraudulent ballots were for candidate A or candidate B. The notion that sufficient number of fraudulent ballots are identified are enough for a judge to void an entire election. That is a different administration of an election than what states have typically done. And these are the tools that Republican legislatures believe will aid them in future elections.
Emily Tish Sussman, Daniel Littman, former Congressman David Jolly. Thanks for hanging with me, guys. I'm having a tough day. Up next, everybody, could there be enough evidence to convict former President Donald Trump in the criminal investigation of the Trump Organization? Plus, this week marked an aggressive new phase in the criminal investigation into former President Donald Trump. Just hours after state prosecutors in New York convened a special grand jury in the years-long probe into his organization, Trump lashed out, slamming it as, quote, a continuation of the greatest American witch hunt in history on his website. Multiple new reports this week say some witnesses have already been contacted or asked to prepare for testimony as the investigation escalates. Joining me now to break all this down is MSNBC contributor and former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance. Joyce, great to see you this afternoon. Thanks for joining us on this. I spoke with Alan Weisselberg's former daughter-in-law, Jennifer Weisselberg, yesterday, who was served an election notice this week, according to her, in retaliation for cooperating with investigators. Let's take a listen to what she had to say.
Now I have to get a real estate lawyer on top of it and try to fight, even though there's a moratorium on COVID, and I've spoken to the Attorney General's office about it. It doesn't matter. Rules don't apply to the Trumps or Weisselbergs. Donald Trump, it knows the owner of my building. They do real estate deals together for decades, 40, 50 decades. And so they have the influence to say, we will withdraw all future real estate deals with you and your management company if you do not do what we say.
Joyce, if this turns out to be true, are there any repercussions, implications for Alan Weisselberg essentially retaliating against her for speaking out, or is that a really difficult thing to prove?
Retaliating against a witness is something that prosecutors take very seriously, and statutes in New York give prosecutors some good tools to use in this regard. It's easy to understand why prosecutors take this seriously. If witnesses can be intimidated with this sort of conduct, then it becomes more difficult for the criminal justice system to get to the truth of the matter. So if this bears out, and if the linkage between this action and her cooperation with Manhattan DA Cy Vance could be established, I would expect it to get serious attention.
We have the special master combing through Rudy Giuliani's electronic devices the same way they did with Michael Cohen. Giuliani's attorneys are saying that the evidence, and I quote, should be exempt from disclosure because of attorney-client privilege between him and the former president. What is the likelihood this type of evidence will be used in court?
This is a pretty extraordinary interpretation of the attorney-client privilege. It's narrow. It applies only to confidential advice and communications between an attorney and a client. So if any third parties are involved, the privilege has evaporated. If, for instance, I'm your attorney, but you and I separately have some conversations that aren't related to me giving you legal advice, then that information isn't covered by the attorney-client privilege. So to prospectively claim that just a broad variety of information is covered is unlikely to be successful here. There is, after all, a special master who will look at this evidence on an individual basis, more than likely one communication at a time, sometimes breaking down segments within a single communication. And ultimately, the interpretation of what's covered by the attorney-client privilege will be far narrower than what Giuliani is suggesting that it is here.
I want to talk quickly here about the timeline of this investigation overall, the Trump investigation overall. We've got the grand jury seated. We also know that Cy Vance is retiring at the end of the year. Where do you expect this investigation to be right now? At what point do you expect it to wrap up? And quite frankly, how do you hire for a job like Cy Vance's when he is in the midst of this major investigation into the organization of a former president?
New York voters will have a choice to make in that regard, and it will take someone, to fill Cy Vance's shoes. He has many years of experience. He's in some ways been controversial. People haven't always supported his decisions, but experience matters. And fortunately, New York voters have lots of good choices in this regard. Crystal balling the timeline, I think, is tough to do, because my expectation is that even the prosecutors themselves don't know exactly when the case will be ready. Often, and particularly in something complicated, when you're trying to flip witnesses, you just can't tell, and you have to let the investigation come to the point where you're ready to make a prosecutive decision, whether that's to prosecute or to let the matter go because you lack evidence. You know it when you get there, but really you don't know it this far out. And the job of the investigation is to establish these basic questions: who, what, when, where, why. The investigators have lots of documents. They have the tax documents that Vance fought so hard for in court. So they likely know everything except for the who at this point. They know what happened. They know when it happened. They know why. They have proof of what happened. What they need to know is who was involved and who directed it. And that's likely what this end stage of the investigation is about.
Joyce Vance, my friend, always great to see you. Thanks for joining us. When you visit a doctor's office, do you have the right to know if your healthcare provider is vaccinated against the coronavirus? Should they be able to keep that information private if it could affect your health? New York Times Magazine ethics columnist Kwame Anthony Appiah looks at the issue in his latest piece and is here after the break to talk about it. We'll be right back. You may be able to see that big summer blockbuster at the movies without having to wear a mask. According to new updated guidelines, AMC Entertainment, Cinemark, and Regal Cinemas are announcing those who are fully vaccinated can sit at their theaters without wearing a mask, but asks those who are not fully vaccinated to continue to wear one. The theaters add that social distancing measures and cleaning protocols will, in fact, remain in place. So in the country's strive for a life reminiscent of times before the coronavirus pandemic, from ending mask mandates to loosening crowd limits as Americans get vaccinated, questions loom about what that looks like. And my next guest is here to help answer one of the burning questions at this stage of the pandemic. Is it okay to ask healthcare providers if they're vaccinated? With me now is Kwame Anthony Appiah. He's the ethicist columnist for the New York Times Magazine. He's also a professor of philosophy and law at New York University. Kwame, thanks so much for joining us on this. Really appreciate it. So in your piece, you kind of put two scenarios out there. One of them is, for instance, going to your chiropractor who says they don't necessarily believe in vaccines and won't be getting the vaccine. Another is sitting in a dental chair, or a dentist chair, I should say, and having the dentist assistant essentially say they don't want to answer your question if you ask them if you're vaccinated, and your mouth at that point is wide open. You're not about to bail with your mouth wide open, and you got all those tools on the inside of your mouth. So what is a person to do? What's the right answer here as to whether or not we can ask our healthcare providers if they've been vaccinated?
If you've been vaccinated, I should be clear, I don't think the risks to you are very high, even in circumstances like that. Nevertheless, it's for you to judge. And in deciding whether you want to take the risk associated with having someone breathing over your mouth, it's relevant for your decision to know whether they're vaccinated or not. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to ask. They may refuse to answer, and you may make your inferences. But I think if someone's vaccine status is relevant to a decision you have to make, then you're entitled to ask it.
You say clinicians who tell you that vaccination is a personal decision as if it doesn't affect and therefore concern anyone else are making an all too common mistake. Can you expand on that?
Right. So both wearing a mask and getting the vaccine do two things. One is they have an impact on the probability that you will get sick. And if you're vaccinated, you're very unlikely to get sick and even less likely to be seriously ill. But they also affect whether you can transmit the disease to others. Again, both masks and vaccines affect what kind of risk you pose to others. Even a person who's vaccinated can, in principle, transmit the virus to other people. And even a person who's vaccinated could, in principle, get the disease. Again, these things are both pretty unlikely, but it's up to people to decide those things, I think, for themselves. And in order to do that, they need to know They need to know what other people are doing. The CDC now says you can go safely into a space if you're vaccinated with other vaccinated people. Well, in order to apply that advice, you have to know whether the other people in the space are vaccinated.
We've also got this idea of vaccine passports, right, when it comes to travel. A lot of folks wanting to get out and about and travel now. That it seems like we have the light at the end of the tunnel, so many folks being vaccinated. You've got at least 10 states with bills or executive orders banning vaccine passports. You got Senator Ted Cruz from the state of Texas wanting them banned on a federal level. When does health outweigh the politicization of this thing, of this pandemic, I should say? And what is the ethical argument surrounding vaccine passports?
So I grew up in Ghana, where my father was from, and I traveled regularly to England, where my mother was from as a child, and I carried with me a yellow document produced by the WHO to record the vaccinations that were relevant to the decision whether or not to admit me to those countries for yellow fever, smallpox, and so on. Those aren't required anymore because smallpox is gone and yellow fever is quite unusual these days. But those were perfectly reasonable measures, health measures taken by governments in order to keep track of who was traveling and whether they were vaccinated or not. So I think there's no sensible reason for denying the use of such vaccination evidence for people who want to look at it, and that might include people putting you on an airplane, where if you're traveling on a long flight with a lot of other people. While again, the risks are very low, especially if they're vaccinated and if everybody on the plane is wearing a mask. Still, it makes a difference whether everybody on the plane is vaccinated or not. I think the main argument that's been made that I have some sympathy with is that vaccination is something that's easier for, as it were, the rich and powerful to get, and that therefore this puts less powerful people at a disadvantage. I think that given that in this country we have made vaccination free and we have put vaccination sites as much as we can as close to people as possible, and we've asked businesses to allow people time off to get vaccinated, it's not reasonable to say that even the most disadvantaged people in our country don't have access to the vaccine if they want it. So I don't myself think that's a very compelling argument. Indeed, there might be an argument, especially for communities of poorer communities of color, for example, that are poorer in the cities. There might be an argument for offering them as an option this vaccine passport, which will make their lives easier, as an incentive to get vaccinated, which would be good for them and, as I say, for their communities, because vaccination is good for you, but it's also good for the people around you.
All right, Kwame Appiah, thank you so much for your reporting on this. Appreciate it. Ready, set, vaccinate, everybody. We're still talking about vaccines. Getting the shot today was as easy as grabbing a burger and beer at the Indy 500. Details on that coming up next. Americans reached the Indy 500 today. Attendees at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway were offered the one-dose Johnson & Johnson COVID vaccine. Here with more on this is NBC's Gary Grumbach.
Hey there, Yasmin. Yeah, the folks here at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway are really taking the race to vaccinate America seriously. The race is actually happening right now as we speak. And right here, if we come down these stairs, this is where folks are getting vaccinated against COVID-19 with the one-shot Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccine. This is now all a partnership between IU Health and the folks here at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. They've actually been doing this for months here in a drive-through fashion. They've been able to bring cars into the Speedway, vaccinate folks in those cars, have them go around the Speedway a little bit and go on with their day. The same kind of thing is happening today in a little bit of a walk-in fashion. Able to walk in here to the First Aid Center, get your COVID-19 vaccine, and go on and watch the rest of the race here. I talked to a bunch of people this morning who were getting their vaccine. Here's what they had to say.
I'm not for it, but, you know, if it means getting everybody else back to normal, then, you know, you do your part. And my kids will quit getting on to me.
I think it's the right thing to do. I mean, you know, we're all in this together, mankind. It's all, you know, we got to take care of each other.
One step ahead to no mask, which would be really nice.
Pretty cool. Yeah, just to say that I was vaccinated at the Indy 500.
Now, Yasmin, for months, folks have been talking about the idea of getting the vaccine out to the people that need them in their communities where they are. Well, this today is where 135,000 people are, and this is exactly that idea. It talks about the convenience factor of this. Folks say they really want something that's more convenient for them. This could not be more convenient. You're just walking right into the first aid center. If this isn't going to get people vaccinated, I think the question is, what will? Yasmin?
All right, NBC's Gary Grumbach for us. Thank you, Gary. Coming up, everybody, searching for answers 100 years later. How the Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission aims to uncover the truth about the deadly attack on a thriving black community. We'll be right back. America has reached the Indy 500 today. Attendees at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway were offered the one-dose Johnson & Johnson COVID vaccine. Here with more on this is NBC's Gary Grumbach.
Hey there, Yasmin. Yeah, the folks here at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway are really taking the race to vaccinate America seriously. The race is actually happening right now as we speak. And right here, if we come down these stairs, this is where folks are getting vaccinated against COVID-19 with the one-shot Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccine. This is now all a partnership between IU Health and the folks here at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. They've actually been doing this for months here in a drive-through fashion. They've been able to bring cars into the Speedway, vaccinate folks in those cars, have them go around the Speedway a little bit and go on with their day. The same kind of thing is happening today in a little bit of a walk-in fashion. You're able to walk in here to the first aid center, get your COVID-19 vaccine, and go on and watch the rest of the race here. I talked to a bunch of people this morning who were getting their vaccine. Here's what they had to say.
I'm not for it, but, you know, if it means getting everybody else back to normal, then, you know, you do your part. And my kids will quit getting on to me.
I think it's the right thing to do. I mean, you know, we're all in this together, mankind. It's all, you know, we got to take care of each other.
One step ahead to no mask, which would be really nice.
Pretty cool. Yeah, just to say that I was vaccinated at the Indy 500.
Now, Yasmin, for months, folks have been talking about the idea of getting the vaccine out to the people that need them in their communities where they are. Well, this today is where 135,000 people are, and this is exactly that idea. It talks about the convenience factor of this. Folks say they really want something that's more convenient for them. This could not be more convenient. You're just walking right into the first aid center. If this isn't going to get people vaccinated, I think the question is, what will? Yasmin?
All right, NBC's Gary Grumbach for us. Thank you, Gary. Coming up, everybody, searching for answers 100 years later. How the Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission aims to uncover the truth about the deadly attack on a thriving black community. We'll be right back.